The following is an audiobook teaser from Second Realm Anthology, a collection of short stories that inspire freedom and self-liberation. To order your paperback copy, just visit libertyunderattack.com/sranthology. Again, libertyunderattack.com/sranthology. This chapter is called 93 Minutes, authored by our pseudonymous Pat Henry. Please enjoy.
He stared through the dim light at the white, popcorn ceiling. The first light of day was beginning to seep into the room through the half-closed shades that covered the bedroom windows. He did not know how long he had been staring at the ceiling. 30 minutes? 3 hours? 3 days? It all seemed so surreal. He could hear the occasional low drone of a truck or the higher-pitched movement of air and engine from the traffic building on the interstate 100 yards from his window. How he hated that highway. He could still remember the arrogant smirk on the face of the judge that dismissed his case when he tried to sue the state to stop the eminent domain proceedings that turned his retirement dream property into a new interstate thoroughfare. The highest and best use compensation that he received turned into 6 lanes of highway, and a median strip was nowhere near enough to be able to purchase a new piece of property. As for his house and the rest of his land, who in their right mind would purchase a home whose 100 acres of attached land were separated by an expanse of asphalt with cars and trucks whizzing by at God knows how fast? If he wanted to hunt his west field, he had to jump in his truck and drive 25 minutes in order to access the nearest road that crossed over to the other side of the interstate. Insane. Not that there was much good hunting left with the constant drone of vehicles. The patch of forest dotted with oak, maple, and walnut trees that he first noticed when he toured the property years ago was one of the first things to be bulldozed and flattened to make way for the construction vehicles. So, he was stuck here, destined to live out the rest of his life being constantly reminded of how the government destroyed his dream in the form of engines and tires humming over asphalt. How long had he been thinking about that cold December afternoon at the county courthouse? On that day he was so angry that he didn't even realize until he got home that he had left his coat in the courtroom and never even turned on the heat in his car. His fury was its own source of warmth. He glanced at the clock on top of his nightstand. 47 minutes. After a few moments of lying thoughtless in the growing light, another memory sprang to mind. He remembered getting his property tax bill that April. He had pulled it out of the mailbox on that cool, spring morning and stared at it for what seemed like an eternity. He remembered being incredulous that these parasites wanted to now exact some sort of tribute for the privilege of having his property destroyed and his dreams have turned into ashes. He had walked back to the house and was about to throw that letter in the trash when his wife scolded him and talked some sense into him. That bill got paid. But it was the last one. When the November tax bill came that fall, he had no one to scold him. 3 weeks before, he had laid his wife to rest, a victim of a robbery at a local gas station perpetrated by 3 men that had just exited from that cursed highway. They would never have been there if that government-created concrete urban cesspool conduit wasn't there. They were looking for an easy score, and his wife surprised them by trying to draw her gun from her purse, but she was a bit too slow, and they were a bit too close. When he looked down at that bill after pulling it out of his mailbox, he began to tear it into pieces. His pace of tearing became frenzied, and before he realized it, he was kneeling on the ground, tearing the torn pieces into small pieces, tears of rage falling into the dirt among the small white pieces of paper. 31 minutes. He looked back at the clock. Almost time to get up and get ready. He absently ran the old cliché through his head. Gonna be burning the candle at both ends today. His thoughts drifted back to the mailbox. He had torn up that November tax bill, the next one after that, and the next one after that. Other letters from the assessor's office began to appear, and those were added to the paper mulch around his mailbox. Then the letters from the courts began to appear, and those were added to the mulch. The weeds around the mailbox seemed to appreciate it. They were higher and lusher than the weeds a few feet away. The phone calls began soon after, but those were easy to stop. 3 sharp tugs quickly removed each of his home phones from the wall plugs, and a couple block caller clicks on his cell were all it took. It was a bit harder to tear up the letter that arrived a few weeks ago. It was being held by a process server. Out of curiosity, he had opened it. The trifolded legal letter informed him that all of his property had been auctioned off the previous week due to delinquent taxes, and that he had 1 year to retain his property if he paid the bidder what they had paid plus fees, blah, 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 blah. He didn't ever waste time tearing up that letter. It was laid out on the counter, and it was still sitting there as he stared at the ceiling this morning. 9 minutes. He looked at the clock again. He must have dozed off for a few minutes. He had been staring at the ceiling for hours, yet his mind and body decided now was a good time for a nap. Weird. The next visit came 11 months and 26 days later. This time there was no letter in hand. The visitor was a large, slightly overweight white guy in a brown uniform sporting a sheriff's department logo on his right breast pocket. On his left pocket was his last name, Rogers. He said that he was there to inform that at the end of a month, in 4 days, at 9 a.m., he would be back with another officer to remove me from the property if my right to retain my property has not been exercised. The sheriff apologized for the intrusion, with a slight sarcastic undertone, and then told me that it would be in my best interest if I was already gone when they came back. He didn't want any trouble, and he told me he was sure that I would not want to spend my first homeless night in the county jail. Without another word, the sheriff turned on his heel and went back to his idling tan SUV in the driveway and slowly drove off without even a glance back. As he watched the cop drive off, he began giggling and muttered to himself, "I am going to be kicked out of my house by Mr. Rogers." 8:53 a.m. He glanced at his clock, glanced back at the ceiling, and sat up. He was fully clothed and his boot heels hung slightly off the mattress at the foot of the bed. He got up and walked over to his wife's dresser. Where her jewelry box and little knick-knacks had stood the day before, was now occupied by an AR-15, a Glock 17, a dozen loaded rifle and pistol magazines, a black tactical vest with a bunch of mag pouches, and a pad of paper. First, he checked the aim-point red dot sight on his rifle. He put on his vest and stowed away all the magazines in their respective pouches. He holstered his pistol as he glanced down at the pad of paper. He didn't want to lose that. It would be quite easy to transfer the address of that judge to his GPS once he addressed the first issues at hand. He glanced over to the edge of the dresser at the orange lighter and the end of a piece of bright green cannon fuse that was taped to the wood. At about 25 seconds per foot, that 12 feet of fuse would give him at least 5 minutes before it burned down the hole in the lid of the 8-pound jug of gunpowder sitting a few feet away in the closet. He absently wondered for a moment if the poor guy who won the bid had thought about homeowner's insurance. His thoughts were interrupted by one car door, and then two, closing hard in the driveway. He heard muffled conversation out the bedroom window as the two officers walked from the driveway to the front of the house. He picked up the lighter, flicked it twice, and touched the flame to the end of the fuse. It smoked and hissed as it caught. He picked up his rifle, checked the chamber and magazine to make sure the green-tip armor-piercing rounds were there, and made his way to the front of the house to answer the door.
You've just heard an audiobook teaser from Second Realm Anthology, a collection of short stories that inspire freedom and self-liberation. To order your paperback copy, just visit libertyunderattack.com/sranthology. Again, libertyunderattack.com/sranthology. This chapter was called 93 Minutes, authored by our pseudonymous Pat Henry. Cheers from the Second Realm.